security and the new system. We have another incredible panel. We're going to talk about a lot of things on this one, but we're going to pick up a thread from the first panel and develop it in new and interesting ways about the institutional questions here. This new technology, the power of the crowd, the power of these open systems and so forth, but how does it affect and change, and what are the implications for institutions, for the United Nations? What is one that, for instance, comes to mind. Second panel has been assembled by the UN and Global Pulse at Social Media Week to explore how these open, social, and real-time technologies are transforming the relationship between people and institutions and putting new pressure on institutions themselves to rethink their future and transform themselves to capitalize on different scenarios of the future. We see a lot of interesting examples, sometimes extraordinary examples, of these pressures in the coordinated uprisings in spots in the Middle East, for instance. WikiLeaks, we managed to have a WikiLeaks-free panel just there. That was quite amazing. See how far we get in this one.
About 30 seconds.
I'm joined in this conversation by leaders with some really rich perspectives on how these socio-technical trends and events are shaping the future of these institutions and the innovation that they'll have to undergo to adapt. You have this. It's got lush bios of the panelists. I'll keep the ones up here on the stage kind of brief. We have here Bob Orr, Undersecretary for Policy Planning at the Office of the Secretary General. Clay Shirky, professor at NYU's Interactive Telecommunications Program and recent author of the book Cognitive Surplus. We have Zia Khan, VP of Strategy and Evaluation at the Rockefeller Foundation, and has the new book Leading Outside the Lines, How to Mobilize the Informal Organization, Energize Your Team and Get Better Results. Zia, thank you for being here. Richard Tyson, co-founder and principal of the Helsinki Group, the collaborative strategy and design team, and had an important role in drawing this group together. And Karen Ross, founder of Independent Diplomat, which does a lot of things, but represents marginalized groups and governments in the diplomatic process where often their voices would not be heard. Thank you so much for being here. So, Bob Orr, let's talk about this. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's technology that is captivating us. We know there is a power in figuring out in close to real time what people are doing, what their agenda is. But how does that impact what a large organization like yours has to do moving forward?
Thank you very much, David. As you were setting this up and you talked about this panel focusing on institutions, the word schizophrenic just jumped into my mind. Not that all institutions are schizophrenic, but that the relationship between institutions, including my own, with this kind of technology, there is a schizophrenic quality to it. On one hand, we use it, we need it, it's developing very fast and very positively. At the same time, it's raising fundamental questions of governance that I think no one has wrapped their arms around yet. So on one hand, there's an open embrace for certain uses and for certain things and by certain people. At the same time, there is some trepidation in various parts of the governance structure in every government, in every international organization. I think today is a perfect day to have a conversation like this, not just that we're competing with some big developments in Egypt right now, but this morning at the UN we had a meeting on the global food crisis. And the difference between what we know now, today, this morning, about what's happening in the food crisis and where it's happening, and what we knew in 2008 when prices spiked in 2008. We knew there was a crisis coming. We started to warn about it. It came. We weren't quite sure where exactly it was and what the drivers of it were. We've been doing work, including using this range of technologies that you've been discussing today, to make sure that we can not only map it much more quickly, but actually use that to get our response into the field more quickly. So this morning, we had a very different situation than we had just 3 years ago, where we could talk about which countries exactly are shorting on which grains, what is likely to happen in the prices in those areas. We couldn't have done that 3 years ago, and we couldn't have done it without the kinds of technologies that you're talking about. So that's the side where everyone welcomes and says, that's great. The same kinds of technologies can and are used in the area of human rights and security. And there's a lot more trepidation on the part of governments about how information can flow around them. So I think there still hasn't kind of gelled a consensus on how to address this. What we're doing is forging ahead where we can get consensus and support. And I think in the areas of food, areas of global health and the needs in global health, broadly the development space, and the humanitarian space, it's developing quite quickly. And I think as with the Global Pulse, we're essentially mainstreaming it throughout the UN. This is no longer a niche group that is concerned about how to use these technologies. It's gone mainstream, and we're just trying to scale it up within the mainstream.
Just want to, before I move on to another panelist, just be sure I'm really clear, Bob. Information from the crowd that perhaps enabled by new technology can be seen as a threat by elites, by governments?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that, information is power, a good old axiom that is proven every day. I think the issues, even if you take something like the food crisis, there are governments that hold certain supplies of certain grains. If the amount of what they're holding becomes available publicly, speculators will start attacking that grain. So the markets are quick moving. The governments are not as agile as the markets or the technology, so they are quite cautious about that. And in fact, this is a subject that we talked about this morning, this power of these tools to help us solve the crisis. But if we do not understand and talk about the food crisis in the right way right now, they will amplify the shocks. We could cause a run on a specific grain. The UN has the wrong announcement today. You could cause a run on rice, and rice is not a grain that we have a problem with right now. You could cause something to happen in the rice market that no one intended. So I think there is a certain amount of concern that you need enough vetting and qualified analysis to be able to interpret what you know about certain things like quantities of rice or quantities of wheat.
Thank you. The actual chair position has no implication here, as we're going to beg Clay's pardon here for just a moment. Zia, from your perspective, as a person who thinks about structures of organizations and optimizing them, in the previous panel we heard people, in fact, representing the UN, hoping to use these new technologies and the way the new paradigm is in ways that improve the world. But a little bit of, well, I don't want to characterize it as exasperation, but there was they're basing it on hope.
Mm-hmm. I think this is just such a timely discussion, and I would pick up on one of Bob's words of schizophrenia, which I would use the word maybe tensions. And when I used to spend a lot of time studying organizations, the fundamental reality is organizational life is all about managing these tensions appropriately. And one of the risks I see with social media is, as with any new kind of emerging technology or really ideology that builds around, it starts to become the hammer that can solve all problems. And I think the fundamental reality that institutions will have to face and how to use this more effectively is to recognize that social media is great at, I think, catalyzing informal networks and getting ideas and knowledge, but those networks and knowledge need to flow into more formal structures that can make decisions and get things done. And creating that fusion between the informal information flows and the formal decision-making mechanisms is going to be the trick for institutions to use this more effectively. And to Bob's point, information is great, it's very useful, but What starts to get risky is when all of a sudden you start to have meta information, and people, like we see in the financial markets, how people are now trading more on information of stock price movements than they are on the fundamentals of what's happening. You can, particularly in interconnected systems, start to get a lot of wild swings and loops and actually amplify the signal to noise ratio, which is really hard when you're trying to make decisions. I actually, at the Rockefeller Foundation, which has been doing development work for almost 100 years, I went up to our archive center up about an hour's north on the train ride. I was going through the files, and you see these just detailed trip reports of program officers, and they're so contextualized, and they're so rich in their information. And I worry that with spurts of data, we'll lose that. So again, another tension of the quantity and perhaps disaggregated nature in which information comes in versus the centralized synthesis of it. So I think for institutions facing this, as individual bodies, it'll be a real challenge to figure out how not to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the traditional structures of hierarchies and authority, and how to fuse these systems appropriately. More broadly, as I think about development and what we try and do, what's really exciting is that there's more and more actors coming into play, social entrepreneurs on the ground, lots of new organizations, and we are becoming a smaller and smaller player in the space, which is exciting. So how can we create lots of intra-institutional cooperation using social media and creating coalitions and networks? I think that'll be another challenge that goes beyond just individual institutions, which is really exciting as well.
Clay,
Yes.
so we got the new technology. We have people that can use that technology to gain a voice that they might have not have had before. There's the real-time element.
Yep.
But how do institutions deal with it?
Well, schizophrenia, attention, take your pick. I mean, the interesting thing about traditional organizational management is in order to get the decisiveness that a large organization has, you typically divide into hierarchies. And hierarchies then transfer the information up one level at a time. It comes from the front line to middle management. And at each step, information is repackaged and then contextualized to the next higher layer. And the effect of this means that organizations are designed to slow information down, right? When information hits a hierarchical organization, it goes through these waves. And real-time isn't just a kind of real-time information isn't just a sort of value-neutral resource that organizations can take advantage of. It actually creates different organizational imperatives. So there was an American military historian and theorist and aviator, John Boyd, who in the last century, in the second half of the last century, studied a bunch of battles from Greek battles all the way through dogfights in World War II. And he said that one commonality of handling information in the battle space is what he called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. And he said that mastering the OODA loop was the key to mastering information in the battlefield. Take in the information, figure out where you are with respect to the decision you need to make, take a decision, act on the decision. And in particular, organizations whose OODA loop can be faster can outcompete organizations whose OODA loop can be slower. Real-time information only affects the first O of the OODA. All it does is it brings the information in faster. If the organization has a structure that slows down the orientation, decision, and action, the delay in action will simply move from the delay in collection to the delay in reaction. So real-time information doesn't make you a real-time organization. And if you look at organizations that actually are real-time, who have people who are trained and paid to act in real time, whether athletes or actors or cops or stock traders, you see a bunch of commonalities to those organizations that are unlike traditional bureaucracies. There's a high degree of autonomy for frontline employees. There's a high degree of training for frontline employees. There's a high degree of tolerance for errors of commission rather than omission, for mistakes that came from action rather than inaction. Most parts of the management structure get the same information at the same time. And over time, to Bob's point, there is a tendency towards public access of existing information if it's moving in real time. And for each one of those characteristics, I think we're going to start to see characteristic bureaucratic failures where the presence of real-time information isn't met by some restructuring. So organizations uncomfortable giving their frontline employees autonomy will be able to take in real-time information but will not be able to act on it. Organizations that don't provide a high degree of training to their frontline employees won't get the advantage out of it. You would hate to hear that you were in a hospital where the better a surgeon was, the less likelier they were to be doing actual surgery, and the more likelier they were to be waiting to hear how other surgery turned out. And yet, for many organizations, the frontline employees are not well trained and they're not given a high degree of autonomy. Those aren't organizations that are great at real time. If there is a high degree of expectation that the different layers of organization will be able to manage the information one bit at a time, so they're not embarrassed to their boss or their boss's boss, those organizations will simply endogenize the delay, right? So that there's still a delay in action. It's no longer about a delay in getting the information from the field. Now it's the delay of middle management sitting on it, and organizations that have discomfort with a long-term trend towards public access will tend not to be able to deal with real-time information well. So the sensors are out there, whether they're devices or people, whether they're brought in by SMS or the web or custom sensors. But the presence of real-time information at the front door of an organization doesn't yet make it a real-time organization. And I think one of the big challenges is, do you try to adapt your bureaucratic culture to that new opportunity, or do you end up hybridizing? There was a conversation in the previous panel about Ushahidi, and should the UN have been the kind of thing that invented Ushahidi, yes or no? I think the answer, no, let Juliana and Eric do it, is probably a better answer than how can we become like that. So I think we're going to see less transformation of these bureaucracies into real-time organizations, and more hybridization between the bits of the ecosystem that do real-time well and the bits that do your idea of sort of decisive action well.
Richard.
I don't know how you follow those three ideas. So a bunch of things go off in my mind, but I'm torn in this conversation. I think this general conversation about institutions. Maybe the way the Egyptians are torn about what kind of government they have and whether they have a government. Do organizations and institutions do the same work in a world that is doubling the amount of information at the rate that it's doubling? Or do they become a different kind of thing? And I think we talked in many things struck me about the last panel. And I'll only mention two. One was this question of expectations, right? And the other was this expectations of the values and alignment of shared objectives of the organization. So, taking the first, expectations, Clay's great point about hybridization, where you have actors like Ushahidi who are not UN actors but are UN actors, or people who are amateurs, as we heard in an earlier panel, or are professionals. That idea of a role in an institution by a person, these technologies really change that. The line between inside and outside radically changes. So that means that ideas that are relevant for decision making, right, change. And that, I think, creates schizophrenia, right? That's where the schizophrenia, I think, in some ways comes from. What is reliable information? Am I allowed to make this decision? If I don't make this decision now, I have to wait for someone else to make it. But if I wait for someone else to make it, I can't make it because the facts on the ground have already changed. And so I kind of feel like this question of institutions is almost this question of how do human beings organize themselves in the modern age, at scale, to deal with the fact that individuals are going to have more agency. They're going to be packed into cities in a much denser fashion. They're going to be more available they're going to have a greater capacity for coordination, of themselves. And so the historical and embedded, maybe even latent expectations of how institutions create a shared action for a society, whether that's a government or an NGO or a community organization or a bowling league, right? I think all of these questions get called into question the more you give individuals the power to play a role in decision making. And so maybe OODA loops themselves, maybe we're in a paradigm shift, right? From an OODA world to a distributed world, and where's the line? I don't know that institutions know where that line is, but I think some of the tools that are emerging to be able to see and construct, we had Sean made a great point about the evolution of our ability to make better decisions with large amounts of data. And the first thing is, how do we see the data, right? And then the second thing is, how do we analyze the data? And then the third thing is, what kind of a stable model can we do or create in order to adjudicate decisions for the organization? And then finally, what kind of decisions are we going to make? And then that leads to, I would argue, a fifth point is, why do we exist, and on what behalf of what values are we making decisions? So, I have a kind of maybe a more radical, point of view, and I think that you look at Peter Senge's work and the idea of the learning organization and the need for innovation not as the making of new things better, faster, but the resilient adaptation of organizations as decision-making shifts to people on the ground. How do you get that to be coordinated, right? And how do you have common values? And the last point I want to really bring into this discussion is one of the things we talked about, not earlier today, but in the panel on Tuesday, was how is it that when you have, competing self-organizing groups, right? You've got the, anti-Mubarak forces organizing themselves using some of the similar technologies that the pro-Mubarak. Now, obviously, they're outnumbered for a lot of reasons. You have, Russia beginning to create a citizens corps of observation of internet activity of other citizens, right? So the idea that there's an informal institution that's not part of the government, that has a value, that is not open, which then goes to the last question is, what role does openness really play, and how do we preserve it? And how do we legislate it? Is it a value? Et cetera. So I think there are I think this idea of schizophrenia is obvious. I think this question of hybridization is absolutely essential. I think this question of organizational integration that Zia brings up is, I think every organization is going to struggle with that. Is it fusion or reinvention? I don't know, right?
Karin, give us some of your perspectives on the lessons that large institutions like the UN should draw from the fact that power may be shifting because of these new technologies.
Well, I don't think it is shifting because of new technology. I think power is shifting for different reasons. There is a much more important phenomenon globally of the fragmentation of power, including away from states, which is much more significant than I think anything technology is producing. As my wife, who's from the Balkans, always says, who's got the money and who's got the gun? That's what determines power, not who's got Facebook or Twitter. And if you look at what's going on politically, we're heavily involved in a process that people will have seen in the newspapers, not in Egypt, but in the separation of South Sudan from North Sudan. We advise the government of Southern Sudan. And new technology has had absolutely no part in that process whatsoever. I was in the Security Council yesterday, the UN Security Council yesterday, with the new Foreign Minister of Southern Sudan. The Security Council, where I first worked in 1997, has not changed its methods at all in the face of new technology. One permanent Security Council member, I'm afraid to say the country of my birth, prided itself on introducing new technology, a new technological innovation into the UN Security Council a couple of months ago for a formal meeting of the Council in, I think, December. That new technology was video conferencing. If you look at a hugely seismic and significant political process like what's happened in Sudan, which is of massive significance for the future of Africa and for other issues elsewhere, it's very clear that the cast of players and who has power and who has not is changing. It's not just about governments. We looked very closely at that process and we realized that the list of people who were significant, of groups that were significant, included a very large philanthropic foundation, several oil companies, 2 billionaires I could name but won't, several large NGOs with or without any legitimacy or democratic accountability, one film star who, as far as I'm aware, had none. That film star, there was a great deal of coverage in this country about a satellite project to monitor the border, the Sudan Sentinel, that was going to monitor the border and stop genocide during the referendum that took place in December. That satellite had no political significance, had no real impact on the political process. It was all these other players that had impact on the political process who were working behind the scenes, and governments were only one of that cast of characters. The world is fragmenting, different actors are entering the stage, and whilst technology may be part of that process, and I don't deny its significance, particularly when I'm reading tweets from Tahrir Square, but I don't think it's actually the most significant shift that we're seeing. I think there is a much more significant shift and fragmentation of power that is a consequence of globalization.
What's so interesting about that, right, is that the large institution like the UN can still run with what you just said, which is technology is part of this process, but the general trend fits in with what they're talking about, what the rest of the panel's talking about, which is there's a fragmentation. Power is changing, and you need an institution that deals with it.
I would dispute your assumption that it's still running. I don't mean that flippantly, and I say this with great respect to many people I hugely respect, like Bob Orr, who do a fantastic job in the UN. I think institutions, interstate institutions, are becoming less and less relevant in determining our world. I worked at the UN Security Council perhaps in its heyday at the turn of the century when we were conducting humanitarian intervention all over the world and winning. History has shown that this project is less successful than it was. The UN Security Council is less significant than it was, and that's partly because states are becoming less significant. And they are less and less able to arbitrate the forces that are determining our world, be they climate change, terrorism, trade, migration. Take climate change, or actually take a better example, terrorism. The UN Security Council after 9/11 set up lots of committees to monitor terrorism, flows of terrorist financing. These things have not been very effective, I think is a fair judgment. They've also been extra-legal. They've created new normative standards which have really undermined legal rules, global legal rules of human rights. It's not been a very impressive performance. One could say the same about climate change, I'm afraid. Cancun has not produced hard targets to stop climate change. Migration, other transboundary forces, which are really the determinative forces and are more and more important, states are less and less able to respond and manage these forces however much they may claim that they can. And I think the political consequences of that are very, very dramatic. And technology is a part of that conversation, but it should not blind us to this much more important and fundamental shift.
Bob, what do you think about this? The idea that we're at a moment in history, we don't have to confine the conversation to technology, but that power is shifting, and that the organization you work for, is there a recognition that the power is shifting, even if they're perhaps not moving quick enough to address the recognition?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that people understand it's shifting. The fact what they view as whether that's positive or negative sometimes depends on what state you work for, but pretty much governments do understand that there are other players in the game. That doesn't mean they like it, but at least they understand that there are other players in the game. Our challenge, quite frankly, is to take that reality that Karn describes and try to get governments to be ready to embrace some things that have two edges of that sword. And I think that's it's a day-by-day struggle, but the fact that almost every government knows that they are more vulnerable today than they were 10 years ago because of the kind of inevitable consequences of globalization have come home. Markets move faster, information moves faster, their citizens know more. Every government knows this. And it's why why I use food as kind of my seminal kind of tracker of this. In 2008, there were governments that were surprised by what happened to them. Today, there's not a government that I know of that is surprised, in part because we're more ready. So we can tell the few governments that really don't know, we can say, by the way, your crops are in the gun sights of a downswing in the market. You better be ready, and we're going to work with you. So it is a mixed blessing. But I think the governments are aware there's shifting, but they don't know. And I think the OODA loop discussion is interesting because, if you take that hierarchical process, it still exists. The UN, governments still operate just like that. But there are carve-outs, I would say our humanitarian space, because everyone wants it to move very quickly. Our systems are adapted to move quickly. So the faster we get information, almost literally the faster we move. But there are other areas, security-related areas, where there are plenty of reasons why quick information doesn't lead to quick action. So I think our challenge is not to try to lump all the kinds of decisions are made at the UN into the same discussion, because I can't use the same technology. I don't have the same political support if I use those same technologies on food, on human rights, on military security at a given border, or at what's happening in a popular uprising.
Is that important for your analysis, Clay? The idea that that a large institution like the UN will react differently depending on what piece of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, a lot of it comes down to errors of omission and errors of commission. Bureaucracies are always organizations that are comfortable with bad things happening because you didn't do something. And this is not a knock on the UN, this is just the way hierarchical structures work. In that list of kind of organizations that deal with real time have a higher degree of comfort with errors of commission, mistakes that people make that you then have to react to. Again, whether you're talking about athletes or surgeons, because that's the way the playing field is set up. But if you look at an organization like the UN, or you take the United States, an error of commission involving, say, nuclear weapons, not the kind of error of commission you'd like to see happen. So there is going to be kind of domain by domain a decision about how much the slowing down and aggregating of information makes the decision better versus how much it makes it worse. And of course the great tension around nuclear arms is the errors of commission of the catastrophic ones, and yet, particularly during the Cold War, we had to be ready to scramble at a moment's notice. And so those are the kinds of pegs you put in the ground around which you sort of wrap everything else. What I do think is that every place, what Bob said about the food crisis is, every place that could speed up its ability to act if it sped up its ability to know, that those are places where we should look to bureaucratic structure and be trying to adapt them. Because the places where the traditional hierarchical structure slows things down just as a side effect of having layers of management, even if a faster decision would be beneficial by the organization's own mission statement, that's where I think the real tension between the broader and more rapid integration of information at the front door has to meet institutional change inside the four walls of the institution to be able not just to gather the information, but also to take action.
Just to jump in from what I find interesting with the OODA loop analogy is if you take a famous customer service story, someone at Nordstrom's, a woman walks in with a tire, wants to return the tire, the sales associate gives her a refund, but Nordstrom doesn't sell tires. But he's fully empowered to just do that to make the customer happy, and they get millions of marketing from that story. You wouldn't want an investment banker to walk into Nordstrom's and say, I'd like to buy Nordstrom's, and have a sales associate sign on the dotted line. Our institutions right now have been sort of sized and optimized to deal with a certain scale of problem and to mobilize a certain scale of resources. I think what's interesting is that they can now drop some of the smaller problems and push those more to the front, but they need to step up to the bigger problems. And right now there is no institutional entity that can mobilize the resources for climate change. And I think in an increasingly globalized world, the scale of the problems is going to get larger. So how do we start to mobilize those resources? And so I think organizations need to rethink what size or scale of problems they want to address. And that's something we've been thinking a lot about at the Rockefeller Foundation. And what kind of resources do we want to coordinate and have really deep discussions on and synthesize a lot of information to come up to a response versus which ones do we want to push out to the ground? And so it's unlearning to do something you're very familiar with and that you've optimized yourself for, and learning to do something that's new and different and there's no playbook for.
I mean, an organization like the UN, would be new thinking? The idea that the big problems should be its purview?
I would think, I don't want to tell Bob, I don't want to shape Bob's job description here, but I think it's one of the few institutions that could have the credibility and the brand to start to think about addressing a lot of these challenges and start to rethink some of these things.
Interestingly, the biggest growth area for the UN, it shouldn't surprise anyone, are in the global issues. The UN is a global organization, but essentially was created to handle issues at the national level. Wars between two countries, a natural disaster or a human-made disaster in a place. There was not an infrastructure and architecture to deal with, climate change for, decades. The global health issue has been a late arrival to the party as globalization has made the threat of global disease kind of more present in people's minds. But I would say the three areas we've grown the most quickly and are innovating most rapidly are in climate change, global health, and food. They're the global issues and the global markets and the global solutions. That doesn't mean we're ahead of the curve, but I think we're actually moving more quickly and adapting more quickly in those spaces than we are in the areas that Karn described, where the architecture that was set up decades ago doesn't look that different than it did decades ago. Where in these areas where there's not as much architecture, the UN is actually taking a much more forceful role and is shaping the space much more actively. And this is a piece of the equation. It's the technology side, can be an enabler to that, but it's, as many said, it's only a piece of that equation.
Richard, you're next with Karn.
Well, I think it's terribly important to make a very clear distinction between types of activity, and I think the UN is very well suited to do humanitarian activity, development, and to be a coordinating body for that, and things like the Global Pulse are clearly very helpful in that. But in terms of a political body, it is less and less suited. It is constitutionally unsuited to the way the 21st century actually is, because it is a body of governments. And although governments see that the world is changing and fragmenting and other actors are emerging, they don't want to accept it. I'll give you a very specific example of what I'm talking about. The UN Security Council was a body set up to deal with conflict between states. 80% of its agenda now concerns conflicts which concern so-called non-state actors, guerrilla groups, separatists, other actors who are not states. And yet the UN Security Council does not talk to those people. It has no mechanism except an informal ad hoc mechanism which is very rarely used to actually engage with those states. And I've asked 140 member states of the UN in meetings over the last 3 years why they don't set up a mechanism to deal with these non-state groups. And they all say, yes, we should, but none of them will, because turkeys don't vote for Christmas, as we say in England, or Thanksgiving in the US. They will not vote for their own demise. They will not set up an organization that will actually reflect the way the world is. So we need to draw the correct political consequence from that, which is to say what will manage the world's problems if it is not going to be governments. What are the mechanisms we use? And I think this reflex of turning to institutions and saying these institutions are perfectible, and if only government were more transparent, if only the UN had better technology and was more coordinated inside its house. This is a reflex which is, I think, inappropriate for our circumstance. And I think we need to be much more radical about what kind of solutions might work.
Richard, then Clay, but Richard, I'm very patient.
Well, I echo what everyone is saying, but I think that we're beginning to see, I think Global Pulse is an example of, I think the open source movement to some degree is an example of what we call, or a lot of people call, transitional structures. So instead of trying to build a big house with big pylons and say, we're going to do, here's our institution now, we do these 4 things, I think increasingly both the value and the power comes from the capacity for cooperation and coordination and negotiation and alignment across many different groups. And I think that this is the huge opportunity of large crowds at the edge being able to come into a conversation. I think what we haven't figured out is how do we fuse or better connect 4 large institutions like the UN and build these transitional structures. A great example Nigel gave is the difference between an agile process of programming and I'd say what was known as a waterfall process. So a waterfall process is you do one thing and then you get it done and then you do the next thing and you know and you're going to predict at the end what you're going to get and you say these are the risks at every step. And an agile process says, I don't know what I'm going to get, but I'm certainly going to put this capacity towards this end goal, and we will be able to adapt just in time to the kinds of things that emerge on the ground. So institutions, I believe, and I think many people believe, need to begin to actively construct these transitional structures, transitional spaces, where more agile processes can become part and or tested and or integrated. And that's never, I think, entirely, and I don't think it can happen entirely even within a single institution. Whether that's BP or whether that's the UN, I think our expectations of institutions as being monolithic, whether those are nation states or those are large oil companies or those are NGOs, I think this fragmentation of power means that there are new institutional structures and there are examples of them, right? Self-organizing, different kinds of self-organizing behavior. I think the open source movement is a great one. Clay's written about that extensively.
But that's profoundly anti-institutional.
Well, I think it's profoundly anti our historical 20th century expectations of what an institution should do. So I think that you can't solve 21st century problems with 20th century institutions, which is true. And the more we expect our 21st century institutions to do exactly what our 20th century institutions did, protect, claim the identities for, speak on behalf of, et cetera, when in fact many of those powers are now shifting, to your point, in many informal ways. I can't predict, how this is going to happen, but I do know that resilient structures that can be much more adaptive and in alignment with the goals that institutions have. We may not get peace and security from a single global institution that protects peace and security. That may not be.
You're not getting it.
Yeah. Agreed. Then I think the challenge is not why is what we have broken, but what must we do in order to create the future in which what did work can work again. And so I think that's a much more productive conversation about the future of institutions. And I think the institution word is I think that to unpack it, what is it, right? Is it an organization? Is it a set of organizations? Is it a relationship of hierarchies? It's ultimately roles that people play and believe are conveyed upon them and their own identity within those roles. And we know that that's changing, right? I mean, Zia mentioned, the informal roles of people within organizations has to be taken into consideration. So I think we're all kind of touching the elephant from different places.
I'm going to get back to that notion. What must we do? Because that's a productive area. In just a second, but Clay, I interrupted you.
I'm actually. I think this will play into this idea, which is I wanted to pick up on the open source piece and something Bob said earlier about information is power. Information differentials are power. When I know something that you don't, The adoption of open source is a way to ensure that information isn't power within a working group. And in fact, the contractual guarantees that surround open source are always guarantees that you can contribute your work without being alienated from it. But as a side effect, there are also guarantees that no matter how much work you contribute, you can never take it away from anybody else. And so working open source communities are often what are called duocracies, which is that you can come into an open source conversation and say, I know what we should be doing with the Linux kernel or Apache plugin handling or what have you, and you can run your mouth all day about what a good idea is. But if you can't either contribute an example of this working or find other people to help you, nothing you say gets executed. And so hence the duocracy. People who do the work of coding are the people whose code gets merged. And this starts out profoundly institutional, as Conor noted, but one of the curious things about the open source movement over the long haul is that large successful open source projects, many of the most active contributors are now paid employees of commercial firms for whom the ability to contribute to the commons precisely so that they can get what they need and be assured that no other company is going to engage in commercial capture actually creates a better outcome for everybody. They find other areas to compete. It's not like the lion lies down with the lamb exactly, but what it does say is the core of the operating system problem we're willing to remand to common solutions. How to build a web server we're willing to remand to common solutions. So to this what is to be done question, I think open source holds out a possibility that when there are a class of problems that several organizations can agree that they share in common, that the cost of each organization solving that problem partially on their own is much higher with much less good results than all of them contributing to the solution. That model of working may in fact allow for a kind of hybridization which is profoundly anti-institutional if you assume that each institution still wants to believe that it controls its own weather within its own domain. But once you move beyond that, once you admit that you're in a world in which a variety of actors are affecting you, whether they're states or not, I think that model holds out an opportunity for cooperation, which actually does lower the cost and raise the value precisely by draining this sort of information hoarding, information is power thing, and instead says, here's the common problem, and we're actually going to use the problem itself as a way of getting the relevant actors to participate.
Yeah. And transparency is the key to that.
And yes.
Transparency is the absolutely essential element.
The issue of centralization, decentralization is key in all this. And I was just kind of looked out of the corner of my eye. I see a nice big centralized UN logo up here. There really should be about 80 logos up here. It should look more like the Social Media Week thing over here with all these different logos in a nice big field. Because the UN is the ultimate, radically decentralized organization in that sense. Many different organizations on different sectoral, organized along sectoral lines. But it is interesting what the technology has started to enable us to do is to take our very decentralized bureaucracies that work in different spheres. We now, with the Global Pulse, have an increasing prospect of having shared information that allow us to cross a lot of those very traditionally rigid lines between the different parts of our bureaucracy. Just to give one example, we have, I don't know how many, at least, if you count gently, 5 food agencies in the UN. One is a development bank that deals with food. One is the, kind of data analyst for food. One is the emergency response for food. If you're trying to deal with a food crisis like we have today, you actually need not only those narrowly defined food agencies to be able to see a lot of the same things in the same time, but then those that are not the food agencies. You need, in the countries where instability is starting to show up, you actually need your peacekeepers to be ready to deal with a new reality on their turf. So it is interesting that the first O on the OODA loop helps us to centralize a bit. So technology does not only decentralize. If you can have a common basis for discussion, instead of the UNICEF representative having his or her information and the WHO representative having his or her information, and then it having to go up all these chains and go back to New York and Geneva, and then a big powwow of the chiefs to sort it out. You can now do a lot more of this in the field. And so our agenda to push this out into the field and to empower our field teams to integrate themselves across these agency lines, so that instead of having 3 people from UNICEF in the country you're talking about, you have 53 people when you combine all the different UN people, and then you really have a picture of what's going on in that country. Traditionally, all that information would have gone back up their hierarchical chains to their respective headquarters. Now you're getting a lot more integration, and I think with Global Pulse, we're going to get radically more integration of our operations. So technology doesn't just fragment, it can help you draw together.
Just a quick, you had a transparency issue, right?
No, I mean, I was
Yeah.
just underlining Clay's point
Yeah.
about, I mean, I entirely agree with what he sees as the kind of emerging model, but the key element of that is transparency. But that wasn't the point I wanted to make. I find it striking that we're talking about how to understand food spikes and not how to stop killing civilians in Darfur, which I think is a much more pointed lesson, presents a much more pointed lesson about what works and what doesn't. And forgive me if I haven't heard that it was mentioned. The lesson of Darfur is that the current models of international cooperation and indeed activism and technologically based activism, you have governments sitting at the UN decrying the killings, you have a peacekeeping force which is inadequate, you have thousands of activist groups, you have coalitions of film stars, you have people setting up hotlines for college students to ring their congressmen, and Darfuri civilians are still being killed today. In other words, the current models that we have of political change do not work in Darfur. We have to look at the outputs of these systems instead of congratulating ourselves on the processes and the innovations that we've made technologically with which to organize, because they are not working. They're not working in Darfur. And the contrast I rather warily make is between Darfur and the Spanish Civil War. In the 1930s, 30,000 foreign volunteers went to fight fascism in Spain. 10,000 of them lost their lives. In Darfur, not a single person has gone on the ground to actually fight. I'm not suggesting that one should, and I wouldn't myself, though I might have done when I was a younger man. But it is a striking contrast on how differently generations see political change and how lazy we've become about actually measuring the outputs of the political models of change that we discuss.
Zia, I totally want to go to you next. I just want to quickly follow up. Are you saying something further, Karin, that it's like that Susan Sontag idea of the problem with photography is that you sort of vaguely confront an injustice that's depicted in a picture, and then you don't go any further, that in fact some of the social networking and technology actually drains the possibility of real action?
Yes. There is a limited pool of political energy, and if it is dissipated in self-congratulatory activist campaigns and celebrity YouTube videos, it is wasted. The only thing that matters is the output. What is the output? How many dead civilians are there? That is the only measure of success or not how many Twitter followers there are, how many people have watched the YouTube video or signed the online petition.
So you need another piece. You need to connect all this.
No, it's a very easy thing. It's very easy. It's one word. It's action. It's physical action is what matters. It doesn't matter what is going on in the blogosphere or online. It is physical action that changes political realities.
To your wife's point about the gun.
Yeah.
Zia? I think that's a really interesting point, and the question I think it poses is to what degree can current institutions adapt, and to what degree do you need new institutions? And I think institutions are always, to your point about what is an institution, they're kind of packages of rules and rituals. And the easy thing to do is to change the rules. The problem is the rituals themselves don't change and are much harder and are invisible and are organic. And you can't top-down change culture. So what new institutions do we need, and do you need to start fresh? I had a really interesting conversation the other day with Paul Romer, who's thinking about charter cities. Can you just clear out space in the developing country and fund new infrastructure and create an entirely new set of rules? So, for example, what if you had a city where there was no currency allowed? all of a sudden that has huge implications for corruption and drug trade and things like that. But you would need to start fresh. You couldn't pull currency out of a city. You'd have to start new and see what kind of co-current rituals emerge with that. To the point of action, I think that's the problem with these networked communities, is they don't have enough common rituals so that they can coordinate to do something. They might have some rules for sharing information, but they won't have the trust or the shared values that maybe the volunteers who went to the Spanish Civil War or the people fighting for civil rights in the South in the earlier part of the last century would have to actually go and do something.
I want to build on this question of rules and rituals. Is one of the things I wonder, where this idea that you can change the rules but the rituals may, culturally be embedded, etc. I think one of the things that we're actually seeing is that the rituals are the things that are beginning to change. So if you take, or not even ritual, I think it's very, very hard. If you take Twitter, and I hate to use it as an example, but if you take Twitter, is it a new technology or is it the expectation of a new behavior, right? And so the efficient distinction, I think one of the things that interactive technology has taught us is that the efficient distinction between new social behaviors and new social rituals and technologies is increasingly blurred, right? So, Facebook is, technically, maybe genius in some ways, maybe really, really not that technically difficult to conceive of, but socially, in terms of an expectation of information use or of possibility, it's very different. And so if we can no longer make efficient distinctions, one of the things institutions have done in the past is they've had making efficient distinctions for rules, is they've been very good at it. We make marketing decisions over here, and we make strategy decisions over here, and we make action decisions over here. But as the rituals begin to blur these lines within institutions become schizophrenic, or everybody tries to, there's a power struggle, or, and I think that this question of, again, that Clay brings up about, to go back to the open source movement, it's almost like coordinating, if we had a 20th century where efficiency and productivity, where we could exclude defects from our manufacturing process, and we could exclude information without fidelity from our decisions, we would then get better and better and better performance. I think we now live in a world where that's just simply not possible. We live in a world where coordination, it's a coordination problem now. And we've shifted from problems of efficiency and production to problems of coordination. And what we're teaching ourselves through these transitional structures is that the value of coordination, and coordination, the possibility of coordination is a public good, right? If you shut down the possibility to coordinate by turning off the internet in Egypt or whatever, then you are essentially getting rid of a new kind of public good, right? And so how do we value that when we haven't valued it? It's a different value system. I think IBM has done a great job in adapting itself to the open source movement. They've really, as an institution, taken this on. Anyway.
Clay?
And only under the pressure of a death threat, interestingly. One of the things we can learn is that desperation is the mother of invention. It's only when institutions really feel like this is an existential threat that they change. I want to follow up on this by offering something Yochai Benkler said has stuck with me for 6-8 months now. Is one of the smartest things anybody said about these kind of new loosely coordinated systems. Observing places where groups of people come together and take coordinated voluntary action, he said loosely coupled systems need motivated actors. That if you're not relying on, I'm doing this because I can make some money, or I'm doing this because my boss told me so, then you need actors who come together, and out of each having enough individual motivation and shared motivation, you create something of value. So I'll offer a fairly practical example. Chris Fabian, sitting over there, called me up summer of 2008 and said, can you come up to the UN and talk to us about these social media coordinating tools? We're really interested in that here. So he and I sat down for a cup of coffee, and by the end of that meeting, we were both saying, we have to do something together. Don't know what it is, we have to do something together. And we invented a class at NYU at Interactive Telecommunications Program where home is, and it's called Design for UNICEF. We've run it 3 times. I've taught it twice. John D'Amato sitting there has done the most recent version. And the most important thing about that class in terms of the relationship between NYU and UNICEF is that no contract has ever been signed. We simply operate in parallel. We both agree that there's considerable value in having UNICEF people come down and talk to our students about how they see the world. There's considerable value in having our experimental model up there exposed to UNICEF. And we never did anything more formal than that. And it allows for a kind of lightweight transfer of, we understand how you think, you understand how we think. We can hybridize to some degree, and we both agree that it's a valuable relationship. But we never got any lawyers involved, which sped things up considerably, as you might imagine. And it started as an impulse, let's just try this, let's lower the coordination costs because we're going to try it, we don't know what it works. But we transferred essentially to personal risk what would otherwise have been institutional risk. If I had let Chris down or Chris had let me down, it would have been a big problem, but not a problem for NYU or the UN. And there may be models of hybridization where you can just say, where are the organizations that we would benefit from learning from and would also benefit from us learning from, so that we can call it a wash and operate together, but not with all of the overhead of a bureaucracy, of 2 bureaucracies in this case, but really with just a lighter weight sharing of purpose and being able to see into different sets of values and organizations, and everybody learns something from it.
So you talk about transparency. Now I know why Chris is coming up with all these good ideas.
What's really interesting to me in that story, Clay, was the cup of coffee. It's hard to have a cup of coffee over the internet. Yep. We did this effort in the Mekong Basin initiative that we funded on disease surveillance networks, recognizing that the spread of disease is pandemic and requires cross-governmental cooperation. No matter how many policies you created, they would just not cooperate. So we got these folks from different ministries to work together on designing the system. It was the working together that created the trust that they could draw on when things came up. And that was really the most fascinating finding from our evaluation. It's just the process of spending time together to do work builds the trust that leads to action.
This again suggests a much more radical solution, and it's been demonstrated by academic studies by a guy called James Fishkin in Stanford, and it's been demonstrated in practice in cities like Porto Alegre and indeed in New Orleans, that if you have mass participation in decision making, what was formerly given over to representative legislatures to do, but in fact instead you have 50,000 people take part in what's called participatory budgeting, where all those groups, thousands of people across their neighborhoods, decide how their city should spend their budgets. You get much better outcomes. You get much better economic outcomes. This is the opposite lesson to what Paul Romer is suggesting, which is basically that foreign autocrats should run, sorry to point at you, but the foreign, I'm singling you out. But Romer is suggesting essentially that foreign autocrats should run poor cities and dispense with law and well, it's one of the things he's suggesting.
I think that's one of the interpretations.
But anyway, the point is that it has been demonstrated that mass participation in decision making makes the same point about your Mekong point. You actually get better outcomes, you get better consensus, you get more respect for facts rather than opinion. You get more enduring policy solutions. You get more equitable economic outcomes in terms of the inclusion of poor and otherwise marginalized groups. This, by the way, is the opposite of town hall meetings, which we were treated to 2 summers ago over healthcare in this country, where there are no decisions at stake. It's just the ventilation of opinion. There has to be real agency. And in fact, what this implies is a radical remodeling of government to be a much more dispersed activity and not centralized within legislatures. And I think it's pretty obvious that even in developed countries as well as undeveloped countries, that system is not working terribly well.
Well, and I think that the fair outcomes and better outcomes, what's really interesting about that is the process itself encourages the buy-in on the decisions as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, rethinking democracy itself. We don't want to make it completely stage this way. We have to reverse the power equation here. How about some of your questions? Got a
They're too
microphone
busy
around here.
watching to see what's going on in
Yeah,
the
is he
square.
done? Is he done? Did he-
Is he done?
Oh, oh. So out of the frying pan into the.
Everything changes, the more things stay the same.
God.
We're just glad to know you've been listening to the panel.
It's like teaching a modern class.
Multitasking.
Right, Clay? This is like you in class. Any questions? Must be some.
What will happen to the Muslim brother?
We'll start here, then we'll go there. Yeah? Here it comes. Hold on. There's a question up, I think here. It's actually right up there. Gentleman here, was it you? No? All right, then you. Okay, here he is.
Gley, your example about the merger, I said the arranged marriage. There was arranged marriage between New York University and UNICEF about class, and I was there, attended and present the case. And I think it's brilliant things. And I think University of Michigan, I was in a meeting, University of Michigan has the same symbol, and they asked me, would UNICEF like us to help them with something? And I think it's just phenomenal, and I think we should stick with it. I think it's a beautiful thing to get the academic, the student, and the institution together in one thing, and to do the good for everybody. I think it's a great example, and I think we should be encouraged. I think as we heard, UN it's an old institution. It's getting older, and I think it need a new blood. And I'm not sure how we're going to get that, because we're going to have all these Frankies blocking it and states. And so I think to more toward the public, to more toward people who make decisions and actions, who action these issues, I think it's better for us as a society.
Fantastic. You had a question here. Tell us your name, sir.
My name, excuse me, Mark Turner. Just with regard to sharing of data, I'd be interested in sort of latest thinking on data privacy. I was in Haiti for a lot of the past year advocating we need to share this data amongst actors who all have an interest in sharing information, let's say on health or social protection issues or domestic violence, whatever it may be. And one of the primary concerns, apart from we don't want that agency to get it because they'll steal our data and they'll take our funds, is that actually this data is private. And we cannot trust sharing this data because somebody somewhere will start leaking this data of private information about individuals. And I'm interested how that thinking is evolving with regards to decision makers need to share this data, but you then need to ring fence it so that the general public doesn't get private information.
Privacy information issues is a key one. We were talking in the earlier panel just briefly, actually during the keynote, about data exhaust, and there's a lot of privacy implications. You want to start, Clay?
Sure. In fact, one of the projects that's come out of the Design for UNICEF partnership is what's called Rapid FTR, for family tracing and reunification, and it was, in fact, one of the things that brought UNICEF's interest to the fore once the group had created the prototype was precisely the Haitian situation. It is like everything, and I think he mentioned this in the beginning. There are just a bunch of places where fundamental goods are also in competition. And the question isn't which one do we optimize for, because you have to optimize for both. The question is how do we balance them? The tension right now around privacy data, to me, if there was a better way to count the number of injuries and death from information not moving, we would have a better way of assessing the risk of information moving too much. But right now, in the death column of sins of omission, there's a 0, even though the number isn't actually 0. We don't know what the damage from not sharing is, although in cases like family tracing or human trafficking, we can guess that it is relatively considerable. One of the interesting sources of competition from traditional organizations is the Wikipedia page that always follows within 5 minutes of a global catastrophe, which always includes lists of people, finder resources. It was a pattern that started after the Christmas Day Indian Ocean tsunami, but is now relatively common. And there is, in a way, an emerging set of practices there that allows for a higher degree of information sharing than the kinds of organizations you're talking about are comfortable with, but is not the same as full public access and transparency. I guess the two things that observing Jorge Just, who runs the Rapid FTR thing, observing him work is, one, there's no substitute for just deep trust building between the various organizations, in this case Save the Children, Red Cross, UNICEF, and a couple of others. And two, surprisingly, once you get that trust between organizations, the nominal external concerns actually fade remarkably in importance, which is to say there are some real privacy concerns, but they're often also used as a shield against, the narcissism of small differences. So I would say that is another place where making inter-institutional boundaries semi-permeable, not completely transparent, not completely penetratable by everybody, is the hard work of the trust building. But we can see in the outside world, as with the Wikipedia page, that other organizations are going to step into the breach if the traditional organizations don't start working on creating that value.
Just use one example to Mark's question or comment. In Haiti, I've been struck by the cholera question, and not, I mentioned before kind of on food issues, you've got global markets where prices will move and the economic market will drive it. In the question of cholera in Haiti, you have a political market. Information shared, like how many cholera cases where, caused a lot of people to act differently in those places and other places without the intermediation of analysis by people who understand cholera, who know what it means and know how to interpret or do the best anyone can to interpret what's causing the outbreak here as opposed to over there. So you do have to think about, sharing data is a good idea, but you do need to get, at some point of that process, a chance for people who know how to interpret it to put their at least best interpretation of what it means into the equation, because otherwise you can get crowds doing things that are against their own and everyone else's interest. And I think the cholera case in Haiti has been a challenge in that regard.
Do you think that in some cases in Haiti, amateurs getting their hands on data led to bad outcomes?
Absolutely. I think the fact that not even just amateurs, the fact that a single expert could say that they know how to interpret the data when in fact the greater community of experts have a different way of looking at it, you can get an outcome. So even if someone holds a PhD in a relevant subject, if people want to interpret that data, they should know that actually most experts don't interpret it the way. So it's not just amateurs, it's how do you give the public a full view of understanding what is not an easy equation to interpret.
I think just the terms data privacy and data transparency are very interesting because they imply different values at work. Privacy being I have a right to keep this information to myself, transparency being I have a right to that information. And figuring that out is going to be a really interesting challenge.
But it's incredibly interesting how transparency has emerged as the theme of this discussion, as the quality that would actually assist decision-making, cooperation, coordination, in whatever emerges in the 21st century as the kind of, and it's clearly going to be a rather messy thing that we see. It's not going to be governments, institutions, all neat and lattice-like. It's going to be a mess. But the one quality that may define whether it's successful or not is transparency.
Not to challenge that, but to build on it a little bit, which is to say, I think there's implied in, when we use the word data, often the sense that data is one thing. It's like a raw material. It's like oil. It's like it doesn't, when in fact, data security or data transparency, I think one of the things we're learning is that, all data are identity laden, right? All data are intent laden. One doesn't collect data without a purpose. One doesn't use data without a purpose, and there's going to be so much of it that we're going to be swimming in the stuff, such that you really have to have more purpose to make sense of it all. So I think this is a really huge challenge for institutions. It's not will data be open. It's like data exhaust. Reverse engineering the paths of U.S. security, within countries just by, getting secondary data that has nothing to do with what secure data is. We'll be able to derive an enormous amount, and how institutions deal with what is inevitably open and how long things can inevitably be held secret, which is getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. I think these are exactly the problems of a coordination problem. I think I really like Clay's point about trust building physically between people who hold cups of coffee in their hand, who ultimately have the final decision about stuff, even if they're from different groups, facilitating those kinds of conversations, not just the broad spectrum ones, but creating spaces for real decision makers to figure out how they're going to deal with this stuff is actually a huge project that has to be ongoing, but I think in more efficient ways with kind of different kinds of structures than we had in the past. It's not like partnership agreements anymore. A lot more informal arrangements, as with Clay's class.
I don't want to stop you if you want to go to questions, David. If you want to.
You've been very, very patient. Tell us your name.
Sorry, Sarah Farmer.
Yes.
Wow, microphone.
Say again.
Sarah Farmer.
Just wanted everybody to know.
Oh, eek. Hide. You've talked about data, you've talked about privacy and transparency. What other things can the UN take from the open data movement that's happening? For instance, the UK government's opening up of its data through data.gov.uk.
Thoughts on final lessons?
I think that I don't know, much too early to have final lessons. The classic planning dilemma around opening data is you say you should open this data set. The people in the institution to whom you're talking say, why should we do that? And you say, I don't know yet. And the conversation typically ends there. Because if you're asking them to take an action on the thought that there might be future value that cannot be predicted or measured to put in the press release, means that there's no incentive to open the data. And so I think the biggest lesson from the transparency movement generally is that the geeks among us who wrongly believe that this is essentially a utilitarian argument, the Richard's raw material, a kind of digital oil, we got that really, really wrong. And I put myself absolutely in that camp. I thought, it's an obvious argument, just make it transparent. It turns out that making the case to an institution that there is a kind of value in the data that you don't know yet because you haven't exposed it to the number of minds who care about it or the other things they know that you don't have, telling someone who's in an institution that the aggregate tacit knowledge about their subject is larger in the real world than it is inside their four walls is not really a strategy to get a meeting in the boardroom. And yet, it's visibly true. There's a wonderful site, Howard Forums, that aggregates all known information among cell phone geeks about cell phones. And engineers inside cell phone companies now direct hard questions to that forum because what the citizens of the world have access to is reality, which no institution has access to. So the big push for transparency is really an argument that says you will be prized as an institution for catalyzing a kind of value that you can neither predict nor create if you hold on to it. And that turns out to be, I thought it was a rule-like argument that we would be making about transparency. It turns out to be a ritual-like argument, which is a much harder argument to make, but it's really changing the rituals around the presumed source of value from the differential between what I know and what you know versus I'm the person that's giving you the source of, I'm the institution that's giving you the source of this value.
Well, but perhaps you can produce an empirical measure of it, and in a way, answering your question, Clay, you asked, we don't have a clear measure of the cost of not releasing information. We don't know the answer to that. And I was thinking about that question, and I thought there actually is a case of that, which is the Iraq War, which is that had the information before the Iraq War on intelligence been released before that conflict, then probably that conflict would not have happened. It's a thought experiment, and let me finish, because, and that the cost of that is perhaps 100,000 lives, $3 trillion, et cetera, et cetera. And this isn't a thought experiment for me because I actually know what the intelligence said, because I read it every day for 4.5 years because I was our Iraq expert at the UN before the war. So I know that thought experiment actually works. It works in practice. there was a cost to information not being released. So I think the answer is there, actually. You don't need a cultural shift, you don't need a ritual shift, though I agree with you about having to convince institutions one by one of the benefits of it, and that's quite hard to do because you're talking about something you can't actually answer. But you can actually historically produce case studies which show the real costs of the absence of transparency.
That's interesting. There was a wonderful thought experiment after the Bernie Madoff thing where someone said, what if, I forget the name of the guy who kept trying to get the SEC to investigate Madoff.
Markopoulos,
Right.
Markopoulos.
And just somebody floated the question, what if he blogged it? And if he just floated it out there, it would have been impossible for a single organization to shut down.
He tried to publish it. He talked to the Wall Street Journal about it, and the Wall Street Journal refused to publish it because of libel laws. In other words, the law structure protected Madoff and not free information.
So Julian Assange might have saved us $3 trillion if he had been around a couple of...
He may yet.
I think WikiLeaks is a huge phenomenon in the world of diplomacy and one that is broadly to be welcomed. So
one of the things that this whole conversation shifts, I mean, one of the things I'm struck by in terms of this conversation is, and it goes back to a distinction that Zia made between rulemaking and sort of ritual enabling, which is to say maybe the center of gravity of institutions is shifting. Like institutions used to exist in order to create structures of rules to follow, and those are now in fact, whether they're state rules or et cetera, are to some degree disintegrating, and now the institutional structures that will be resilient are in fact ritual harnessing or ritual shaping, probably more ritual harnessing, as there's this feedback loop between new behaviors at the edge around hard problem solving with cell phones or around, organizing around political change. So how do institutions build in this ritual shaping with intent? As opposed to protecting the rule structuring that they've had in the past, which makes them schizophrenic. It's a really, really interesting, different way of thinking about the word, institution.
We have several panelists that got to go to something else. I'm sure you do too, but I want to thank you, the audience, and I want to thank this wonderful panel. And I want to thank the organizers of this event. I think I learned a lot here. I hope you did as well. Thanks a lot.
I'd also like to echo our thanks, especially to David Brancaccio for doing such a great job of moderating these afternoon discussions. To our fantastic panelists, I think it's one of the most thought-enhancing panels. It's kind of blown my mind, some of the things we've covered today. And we actually hope that this will be the first of a lot of discussion about these kinds of issues. The UN is thinking deeply about a lot of these issues. We realize that these problems are not just the UN's problems, they're everyone's problems. And I think one of the great things I really enjoyed from that discussion was how by acting cooperatively we can all add value to the discussion and to solve these problems together. That seems to be a strategy that I derive a lot of positive encouragement from, and I hope we can continue these discussions in order to start to come to some of the outcomes that we're all so desperately working towards. So I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and thank our panelists once again. I'd also like to thank just before we go, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Social Media Week for all the work they've been organising the event, and to the Paley Centre, and to our sponsors, the UN Foundation, the Vodafone Foundation, and Helsinki Group. Thank you.